Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be following up on yesterday's video, where we detailed the Jack the Ripper case, going over what it was like to live in London in 1888 and how someone like Jack was able to get away with his crimes without detection. We're going to be delving into the theories about the identity of the Ripper, going over all the surrounding evidence, and who the majority of people believe is responsible. Because of the widespread fascination surrounding this case, we will likely never see it properly solved, with modern breakthroughs in the case being met with scorn and irritation. Because the victims have long since perished, and the case occurred so long in the past, the majority of people do not feel the same way about this case as they would with a modern murder, and take joy in the speculation. Finding who killed these women isn't the point for most people who look into this case. It's about theorizing and going over the evidence. It's not our prerogative, therefore, to debunk or discredit any such claims. If there is a theory that you personally find more compelling, or you have your own that you would like to share, feel free to leave it in the comments down below. If you're sharing links in the comments, those are automatically filtered into spam by YouTube, but otherwise, we welcome the discussion and sharing of knowledge. If all has gone to plan, this will be our third upload for Dreadsgiving, where we upload every day the final week of November. We hope that we've been able to largely stick to our plan, even though our luck and internet is often not on our side. These videos are made as a way to say thank you for all the support in the past year, and we hope to continue to do celebrations like this into 2025. As always, if there is any content you would like to see on the channel or a story you want more attention brought to, let us know by either leaving a comment down below or emailing us at dreading.official@gmail.com. We're constantly going through our email suggestions daily and adding new topics to the list of stories to cover. Please be aware though, we are not private investigators. All we can provide is coverage of a case that has already been reported to the proper authorities. We cannot attempt to solve a case for you or investigate it in lieu of going to law enforcement. While the vast majority of our subscribers do not need that clarification for them, the past few weeks have shown us that a reminder is necessary on our content. We apologize for any confusion past videos may have caused in that regard, but with all of that said, let us begin. Jack the Ripper is known to have killed at least 5 women, known as the Canonical Five. There are other murders that happened in the area during the same time of the women who fit the general victimology, but most agree that they were not Ripper kills, due to certain consistencies in Jack's crimes that did not match. In yesterday's video, which will be linked below for ease of viewing, we went over the general social-political climate in London during the late 1800s, and discussed how women were often forced into sex work due to their circumstances. It wasn't uncommon for women to be regularly beaten, either by men who used their services or by their husbands, and murders were not uncommon in the area. Though Jack only killed prostitutes, if that were the only relevant factor, he would be credited for more murders. The key defining factors of a Ripper kill was firstly the location. It wasn't enough that the murders were in Whitechapel. They were also done in areas that were somewhat isolated but still public. He only killed one woman inside, that being the final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, which was seemingly done out of necessity due to the widespread panic the murders caused. Areas he seemed to enjoy killing in were on the main streets, but ever so slightly removed. Alleyways, staircases, and small alcoves located right off of the main thoroughfare provided just enough cover for him to kill without being seen, but still to be done in public, which seemed to be important to him. He was also intimately aware of the area, and could seamlessly blend in with his surroundings, so much so that when he committed 2 murders in one night, and the police were actively combing the streets trying to find him, he avoided any sort of detection and was able to purposely drop 2 pieces of evidence to taunt them. This would suggest that he was exceptionally ordinary, and that the majority of men would view him as being harmless. When we think of vicious serial killers, the image our minds tend to conjure is that of a man who looks like a monster, someone big and imposing who sticks out like a sore thumb. But killers who grab that kind of attention are often caught swiftly, and given the amount of men who had joined various vigilance committees at the time, this man would have had to have been so physically unimposing that those men would not have registered him as a threat. Secondly, the vast majority of his victims were older women who were all described as alcoholics. This could be because they were easier to overpower in their inebriated states, or that the older woman served as some form of surrogate to the woman he actually wanted to kill but couldn't. This would imply that the killer had a negative relationship with an older female figure in his life, likely his mother or possibly his own wife. The fact that he would have to trick his victims into going off alone with him would also indicate that he wasn't physically intimidating to his victims, that there wasn't anything too off-putting about his appearance that made them question their safety, and he couldn't necessarily use brute force in his attacks. Another repeating pattern in the Ripper murders was how the women were killed, as their necks were all slit from left to right, in either 1 or 2 long cuts. It is suspected that Jack would cut their throats from behind, catching the women off guard. Again, this could indicate that the person responsible for the crimes was not actually physically stronger than the victims, and was less likely to be able to dominate them if they saw the attack coming. The murder of Liz Stride seems to showcase that, as Liz had a significant amount of defensive wounds and was seen fighting with a male attacker. Liz's murder missed some of the hallmarks of the Ripper Killer, as he was not able to escalate his mutilation, as she had been so loud that he was fearful that she would attract adverse attention. This would suggest that Liz wasn't caught off guard and was actively able to fight off her attacker. As the killing continued, the viciousness of the attacks would increase exponentially, with him taking out the organs of his later victims and mutilating their faces and bodies. However, despite all the women working as prostitutes, Jack never sexually assaulted them, which is incredibly odd, especially for the time frame. It was also clear that whoever Jack the Ripper was, he had some knowledge of anatomy. The killings were quick and precise, with him being able to quickly dissect his victims on the street without gaining undue attention. This has led to many people to suspect that he had a background in medicine, or worked as a butcher. There were some other cases that many would attribute to Jack the Ripper, but after the killing of Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper seemed to cease operations, which is not something that you would usually see. Serial killers, especially ones who gain any sort of notoriety and fame, usually continue killing until they are caught or killed themselves. It could be possible that the killer could have moved away and continued his crimes elsewhere. Most of the theories revolve around that aspect, as that's the number one question most people who talk about the case discuss. Why did Jack stop killing? Where did he go? And what caused him to kill in the first place? With all the pertinent details laid out, let's go over some of the most prominent suspects and theories. In our previous video, we went over the first suspect named in the Ripper killings, Jack Pitzer, aka Leather Apron. But he was far from the only man suspected at the time. Aside from Pitzer, the police had a theory that the murders were being committed by a group of young men, who they labeled high-rip gangs, who mainly desired to stoke societal unrest. However, after the murder of Annie Chapman, the police dropped the theory entirely, believing that had a group of people been involved in such horrific attacks, one or more would have come forward and given up the gang, especially when money was eventually offered for any information around the murders. The Sun, who had run the defamatory and anti-Semitic articles around Pitzer, would also go on to name another man as being Jack the Ripper. We'll discuss the suspect in a bit. But in response, one of the lead investigators, Melville McNaughton, would publish his own memorandum about who he believed was responsible for the murders, naming 3 suspects that he felt confident in, which is a very contradictory sentence, because if you felt confident enough to publicize that you believe that they are guilty, then there really should only be one person. Otherwise, best case scenario, you are simply defaming 2 innocent men. Melville would state that he was 100% sure that Druitt was the one responsible, going as far as to state in his final years of life that he knew he was responsible for the murders, but because he couldn't reasonably prove it, he was forced to keep the case open. According to Melville's notes, John was, quote, a doctor of about 41 years of age, and a fairly good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, and whose body was found floating in the Thames on the 31st of December. 7 weeks after said murder. The body was said to have been in the water for a month or more. From private information, I have little doubt but that his own family suspected this man of being the Whitechapel murderer. It was alleged that he was sexually insane. Melville would also state that John's suicide that followed Mary Kelly's murder was a clear indicator that he was responsible. He claimed that John was likely horrified by the atrocity that he had committed, that he had possibly been in a dissociative state, or been possessed when he dissected the young women, and when he eventually came to, was shaken by what he had done. McNaughton posited that it was likely that the guilt of being the Ripper got to him, and his suicide shortly thereafter was proof of that. Knowing only what Melville had stated, the case against John seems compelling. John worked as a doctor, giving himself the medical knowledge that he would need to carry out the murders, and it would also allow him to walk the streets in soiled clothing without drawing attention. If he was a widely respected doctor in the area, he could simply claim that he was coming from a surgery, or that he had made a house call, and people would have believed him. His suicide would also easily explain why the killings came to such an abrupt end. And while all that sounds damning, the majority of what McNaughton stated about John was patently false. Firstly, John was not a doctor. Many members of his family were, and he had supposedly considered the position early in his life, but he had never pursued the profession himself. Instead, he worked as a teacher, and was actively pursuing being a barrister, which would mean that he likely lacked the medical knowledge to kill as effectively and steal his victims' organs. This was commonly known about Montague, and it seemed strange that the investigator would be unaware of this. Similarly, Melville noted his age incorrectly, as he was 31, not 41 at the time of his death, which is another hint that Melville's investigation into John wasn't necessarily as robust as he would want the public to know. It's a simple mistake, one that many people could easily overlook, but a lead investigator getting someone's age wrong is telling, especially when all the documentation surrounding the case says otherwise. And although his suicide could explain why the Ripper kills ended, had he been the one responsible, but his brother would state that he killed himself after losing his job as an assistant master of a school. That was the only means he had to afford his schooling, and without it, he was likely to end up on the streets. As we noted in our previous video, that was a fate that most felt was worse than death. The streets were overrun with waste, disease ran rampant, and it was commonplace to see and hear assaults when you were walking down the street. If you were hit with the prospect of losing everything and had no real means of supporting yourself during that time, it was actually extremely commonplace for people to kill themselves to avoid that suffering. In the week prior to his own death, he had been let go from his job and left a suicide note explaining his choice to end his life. It read, "Since Friday I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die." For further context, his mother had reportedly gone insane in the year prior. Melville's later statement that Montague's family believed him to be the Ripper had also been somewhat debunked, as none had directly made that claim. And given that most of what Melville said about the deceased was false, that point likely is as well. This case was one of the most known unsolved mysteries of all time, and Melville would state that not solving it outright was his biggest regret on his deathbed. Though he would have no way of knowing the cultural impact this case would make on the world, he knew that he hadn't been able to properly solve it, and that his name would forever be associated with that failure. And it would seem that he let his desire to solve the case cloud his judgment. Montague obviously was not the Ripper, he couldn't be, but because Melville wanted to solve the case, he practically forced the innocent man into fitting the description. But he was far from the only suspect that Melville would do that to. Another person who Melville heavily suspected of being the Ripper enough to name publicly was a man by the name of Michael Ostrog. Michael was a Russian-born criminal and con artist who was active during the time of the murders. His rap sheet was extensive, and he was well known for petty crimes like theft, fraud, vagrancy, and had a habit of posing as a doctor or a priest in order to deceive people out of their money. Michael was also supposedly mentally unwell and spent a fair amount of time in asylums. However, it's not entirely clear as to why he was placed there. During these times, if someone had a mental health crisis or was dealing with grief or trauma in a way that was deemed unacceptable, they would be sent to an asylum until they were cured. These medical institutions would, quote, cure people, unquote, in ways that were torturous and would often make them worse in the long run. They were traumatizing patients, and it's unlikely that Michael was ever really helped while there. It's much more likely that Michael learned how to mask his more outrageous behavior and lost his ability to trust any authority figure during his stints. His close proximity to the medical field as a patient also gave him the keen knowledge of the industry, which helped his later cons. And once more, while McNaughton would be adamant that Michael could be responsible for the murders, the majority of information he seemed to have on the man was objectively wrong. His notes would state that Michael was a Russian doctor who had been detained in an asylum for being a homicidal maniac, which was completely untrue. In fact, all the available evidence says otherwise. Michael was never known to be violent, running cons against people but never physically assaulting anyone. The closest he ever came was taking a police officer's gun at a station, but even that wasn't done with the intention of shooting anyone. He was in the middle of a mental break. None of his medical documents that were found during the investigations stated that he ever had violent fantasies, and instead stated he was a clever man who would have been able to make his way in the world had he not fallen into a life of crime. These documents also state that many of the people who examined him felt as if he wasn't mentally ill, and was instead putting on a show in order to get lighter prison sentences. They noted how his symptoms always seemed to worsen when he was on trial, which they felt was obviously illegitimate. No evidence ever manifested against Michael, and he would spend the remainder of his life in and out of prison, meaning that the Ripper had no reason to stop his killings. Again, even though Melville was correcting what he believed was bad reporting around the case, he was so focused on finding who the killer was that he actively altered the facts on who he was investigating. Michael objectively could not have been Jack, and absolutely none of what Melville had put forward was accurate, but that wouldn't be the case for the final name he would put forward. McNaughton would describe Aaron Kosminski as being, quote, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane, owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class. and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889, which largely seemed accurate. Aaron's father was a successful tailor, and his brother worked as a barber. The family, save for his mother, would all move to London in 1881, right before the murders began. But Aaron was another matter entirely. Though it was said that he would, on occasion, work alongside his brother, his ability to interact with the world at large waned often, and he had to rely on the kindness of his family to get by, due to his worsening mental illness. Aaron was said to believe that he knew all of the movements of mankind, and that he was aware of everyone and everything at all times, and would be entirely unreasonable in conversation. He would also eat unfinished food from out of the garbage, and was seen multiple times eating out of the gutter. Aaron's family had money, and would try to take care of him as best they could. He would be offered fresh, clean food and rejected, choosing instead to eat out of the sewers and drink filthy water that he found. In his mind, it was the only food he could trust, even though it was covered in human waste. In 1891, Aaron would be fully institutionalized for auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, as well as self-abuse, which many experts believed to mean excessive masturbation. His entry into the country and later institutionalization would explain why the murders stopped so abruptly. However, like the rest of the men named in Melville's statement, he had obviously taken some liberties in order to make Kosminski look more guilty. No evidence was ever found that he had a great hatred for women or prostitutes, aside from once pulling a knife on his sister after she tried to get him to eat clean food. He was known to be excitable, and would lash out at attendants while in the various asylums he would be placed in throughout his life. But his aggression was often in response to what was happening around him. When he lashed out at others, it was always a reaction, and it didn't appear that he held any malice towards any particular group of people. Otherwise, he was not classified as being a danger to others, or homicidal. It's also notable that Kosminski lacked any of the tact that would be required to get away with any crime, much less 5 horrific murders. The Ripper was not a spree killer. He didn't simply kill the women and then run. He was clever. He had to have been able to avoid notice, especially on the night of the double homicide. This would be someone who cops wouldn't suspect, or a person who could walk past them and not raise an eyebrow, and Kosminski was decidedly not that. Aaron's filthy appearance and his behavior would have immediately put him on the police's radar. If he had passed by any officer on the night of the double event, they would have immediately detained him. That said, many of the investigators did not believe that the person responsible for so many horrific murders would be able to simply mesh into society. They felt comfort in the notion that whoever had killed the women would stand out like a sore thumb, even if the very idea is nonsensical, like Skeletor, or Jerry's cousin from Tom and Jerry. You know, the little mouse with the bowler hat and a little sweater. That same idea still holds true today, as people generally find comfort in the notion that we can properly sense danger in those around us. But there are countless examples as to why that is not true. This is also true of those who find some amount of comfort in conspiracy theories, but more on this later. The next man that those closest to the case believed to have been the Ripper was a man who went by the name of George Chapman. Chapman was born Saren Klosowski in Poland in 1865 and was trained as a surgeon. He started his training when he was just 14 years old and was said to have a keen fascination with the human body. His life in Poland was said to have been prosperous, and in 1887 he would move to London and found work as a barber. It's unlikely that he wanted to change his job, as a medical professional would have a bit more social status. However, due to the economic climate at the time, he seemed to take whatever he could get. He would stay in London between 1887 and 1891, moving to the US with his wife shortly after the last canonical murder. However, the marriage would not last. While living in Jersey City, he would get into a violent altercation with his pregnant wife. She would later state that their marriage had become riddled with abuse after she became pregnant, and it was only when she feared for her life that she eventually left, taking a boat back to London to get away from him. According to some reports, Klosowski had pushed his wife onto their bed and sat on top of her, making it impossible for her to get up. He then began to strangle her with his hands, before he was interrupted by a customer coming into their shop, which was right next door. He then got off of his wife and serviced the client. Shocked at the brutality of his attack, his wife pulled herself up from the bed, but in doing so reached behind one of the pillows and found a large knife. Immediately knowing that he had planned to use the knife on her, she left the home and moved back to London, hoping he would stay away. Klosowski would follow after her, but by 1893, the relationship would come to a magnanimous end, and he would move on with a woman named Annie Chapman. Annie had no relation to the Ripper victim of the same name, but it would seem that Klosowski liked her surname so much that he took it for himself, changing his name to George Chapman during the relationship. However, he was similarly abusive with Annie, as he was with his previous wife. He routinely beat her, and when she fell pregnant, he would shock her by returning to their shared home with another woman, who he informed her he was seeing. Despite the relationship coming to an abrupt end, he would keep her name. The woman that he had brought to the home was named Mary Spink, and the two would live together from 1894 to 1897, when Mary would tragically fall fatally ill. Mary was an alcoholic whose husband and son had recently left her high and dry. Noting that the woman was on her own and vulnerable, Chapman would convince her to start multiple barbershops with him. Mary agreed, and eventually the two would find some success, offering what they called musical shaves, where Mary would play piano while Chapman worked on the clients. The musical shaves were said to have made their clientele feel extremely extravagant and well taken care of, while being priced reasonably. The duo earned more than they had expected, so much so that George would eventually buy a boat with his earnings, but their relationship was still fraught with abuse. George, it was said, would beat Mary every night. Neighbors and customers would state that she was always riddled with welts and bruises, and wouldn't be able to play the piano for long lengths of time due to her injuries. On at least one occasion, Mary was seen with a large bruise on her neck, but refused to tell anyone how it came to be. As time went on, the barbershop began to fail, likely due to Mary's inability to perform, due to the abuse that George was inflicting on her. With nothing else to their name, and seemingly nothing to lose, George would poison Mary. It was said that Mary was stuck with a fatal illness, spending multiple days in the hospital before ultimately succumbing to the disease on Christmas, and her grieving widow, George, was left with £500 from her life insurance. Following her death, Chapman would go on to work at a pub in the area. He then hired a woman named Bessie Taylor, and the two would begin a romantic relationship, but Chapman continued to abuse the woman he purportedly loved. Because they worked together, George was often seen and heard screaming at Taylor, and on one occasion, he would pull a gun on her at work. Shortly after their relationship began, Bessie began exhibiting the same symptoms that Mary had prior to her death. Despite her sickness, Chapman moved Taylor out of the area, and she would eventually die in 1901, again leaving George money in her will. Less than a few months later, Chapman would begin another relationship with a woman that he worked alongside, named Maud Marsh. She too would be abused and then killed by Chapman. However, her death would not be so widely accepted. Her family suspected that Chapman had killed her, and they brought her deceased body to their own doctor to have him perform an autopsy. The doctor found obvious signs of emetic tartar poisoning, and upon bringing these findings to the police, the bodies of his two other deceased girlfriends were exhumed. Their bodies also showed clear indicators of poisoning, and he was charged and convicted with all three murders on March 19, 1903. Out of everyone we have covered thus far, George being the murderer does make the most sense. He was trained in the medical profession in Poland. He would have the right knowledge in order to execute the crimes, and he fit the only description of the Ripper that we were ever given. He was also competent and working in the area during the murders, meaning that had he been walking the streets at night, he would have come up with a reasonable excuse as to why he was out. Unlike Kosminski, Chapman would be able to properly manipulate an officer into letting him go. It's also notable that when he left and moved to the US, the murders ceased. Chapman also clearly demonstrated a pattern of misogyny and violence towards women. However, his crimes were significantly different from the Rippers. It isn't unheard of for a violent criminal to change their preferred method of killing. However, it is strange. The Ripper was known for extremely violent murders, dissecting and destroying the bodies of his victims beyond recognition. Meanwhile, Chapman killed his confirmed victims in an extremely passive way. A killer changing their modus operandi so drastically would be indicative of something happening to them that would force that change. For example, a physical impairment. If the Ripper had been harmed in the final murder and was no longer able to kill women the way he had, that would likely lead to this shift, but there's absolutely no indication that that occurred. Chapman's medical expertise has also been called into question, as many experts who have looked into this theory doubt that he was actually trained to be a surgeon. Based on some records, they believe that he was a nurse who had little interest or skill in the medical field, which is why he left it upon moving to London. They argue that had he had any real medical knowledge, he would have been employed as a surgeon and been able to make a better living, which is hard to argue against. Out of all the potential suspects that we've covered so far, Chapman is the most compelling, given that the information presented was not woefully misconstrued. But with that said, it's still unlikely that he was the Ripper. The next person who was widely considered a suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders was a young man named Thomas Cutbush. Thomas was the person who the Sun newspaper named as being the Ripper, based solely on the journalist's own speculation. As previously mentioned, the Sun had published many defamatory and anti-Semitic articles about the case, where they named people as being the Ripper without any evidence, and this was another case where that was true. However, The articles naming Thomas would also posit that the police were covering up his involvement with the murders, even though they would have no reason to do so. Again, this kind of thinking is in line with what we have said earlier about conspiracy theories, and how many find them to be somewhat comforting. The Ripper had been inactive for about 3 years when the Sun published these articles, and there was a significant amount of outcry because the killer had yet to be caught. Many had already lost trust in the police force, feeling as if they didn't care to protect the people living in the area, and they believed that either the case wasn't being taken seriously or that those in charge were actively helping the murderer because they didn't like the lower class. To put it in perspective, the notion that the police were genuinely trying to solve the case and were simply coming up empty was terrifying. That would mean that someone as perverse and evil as the Ripper could be walking around, without any suspicion, and they would be none the wiser. That someone could brutalize 5 women, destroying their bodies past the point of recognition, and move on with their life as if nothing happened. With that in mind, it's much more comforting to feel as if the police know who is responsible, and have conspired to keep his name from being made public, or that they aren't actually doing their best work to close the case. But just because people want that to be true, doesn't mean it was. Thomas Cutbush was a man who was struggling with what many believe today to be paranoid schizophrenia. He was mentally unstable and would regularly attack those around him, believing that they were trying to poison and kill him. He was said to have extreme behavioral issues, which led him to being unable to hold down any job. Medical notes from the time indicate that he would have large mood swings, and would spend much of his days alone, reading medical books in darkened rooms. At night, he was said to wander the streets of Whitechapel, climbing walls and jumping over fences, in order to walk unseen. The veracity of these statements are up in the air, given that they came from the Sun. The paper would also report that he contracted syphilis from prostitutes in the area directly before the killing, which led to his behavior changing for the worse. He was said to be extremely aggressive following his diagnosis, and would regularly attack women after the fact, but this was also not 100% accurate. According to his medical records, Thomas was never diagnosed with syphilis, and there is no record of him contracting any disease from a prostitute. Though he had attacked 2 women by stabbing them in the buttocks on 2 separate occasions, these attacks were extremely frenzied, and nothing like what the Ripper had done. Thomas was a man experiencing a long-term mental health crisis. His ability to understand what was happening around him was extremely limited, and he would perceive normal interactions as being life-threatening. In response, he would lash out at those around him, believing that he was rightfully defending himself. Like with Kosminski, Thomas's obvious mental health struggles and inability to fit in with his surroundings would have led to immediate police attention. Had he been seen walking near the crime scenes, he would have been brought in under suspicion of murder, and his apprehension would have been immediate. Karl Feigenbaum was a German sailor who had moved to New York City in 1894. Shortly after arriving and signing a lease for a small room in a single mother's home, Karl would then kill the woman by slitting her throat in her sleep. Karl was almost immediately caught, largely due to the fact that he hadn't realized her son was sleeping directly next to her and saw the whole event. After Karl would be tried and executed, his lawyer would publicly state that he confessed to being the Ripper, and some experts who have looked into his life were able to produce even more potential victims. Because Karl worked as a sailor, he was able to travel the world with very little restriction, meaning that the Ripper might not have stopped killing the way that the public believes. But like with the other theories, there is very little supporting evidence to go off of. Many who believe this theory have used the fact that when he killed the landlady, he chose to slit her throat, which was in line with the Ripper's MO. However, other elements that seemed important to the Ripper were missing. The concept of the Ripper being unattached to the Whitechapel area is an intriguing one, and automatically opens the possibility of him being responsible for more murders, which many experts find fascinating. However, there's a significant lack of evidence that indicates that Karl is the Ripper, besides his lawyer asserting as much. John Barnett was said to be the boyfriend of Mary Jane Kelly up until the week prior to her death, and is one of the most popular theories as to who was behind the killings. Barnett was an Irish immigrant who had moved to London when he was just a child. It was said that he had a personal issue with prostitutes and alcoholism, finding them disgusting and morally objectionable, and it often led to physical altercations. Barnett was desperately in love with Kelly, so much so that it's unknown if they were ever truly in a relationship. Some records show that Mary might have viewed him solely as a roommate and a friend, but he routinely spoke about her being his wife and wanting to be with her always. She was young and described as being beautiful, especially when compared to the other Ripper victims. After getting fired from his job as a fish porter, Barnett lost the ability to support himself and Mary, leading her into working as a prostitute. She was able to bring in good money for them both, so much so that they were able to keep their apartment without issue. But this change was said to deeply upset Barnett. He felt as if she was becoming an unclean woman, and would routinely lash out at her aggressively because of the fact. On at least one occasion, Barnett was seen throwing blunt objects at Mary during an argument, which resulted in a window of their apartment breaking. John would later state that after this fight, both parties would use the broken window as a way to gain access to the home, as they had both lost their keys and couldn't afford to buy a new one. But with no other way to make money, Mary continued to work as an unfortunate in the area. Theorists believe that John's work as a fish porter would have given him some skill with a knife, and his anger towards his girlfriend would have led him to murdering other prostitutes in the area in order to scare her. He might have felt that if there were a killer in Whitechapel, one that was specifically targeting women like Mary, that she would stop working as a prostitute and become more reliant on him. And at first, the plan seemed to work. According to those around Mary and John during this time, he would routinely read any reports about the murder to her, emphasizing that she could be next, as she fit the basic victimology, and she was reportedly terrified. Initially, she stopped walking the streets and would only accept clients that she trusted, but as time went on, their need for money worsened, and she had no other choice but to go back to sex work. If John really was the Ripper, the steep escalation in the murders could have been done in order to cause Mary more anguish. If she hadn't been properly deterred by him simply slitting his victim's throat or disemboweling them, he would have to get more and more violent until she took him seriously. Others believed, though, that the escalation was more of a sign of his mounting anger at Mary, that he had grown so resentful towards her that his love had morphed into hate, and the more she failed to do what he wanted, the more intense feelings of anger he had towards her, and the resulting murders were just an indicator of that. Towards the end of October, Mary would rent out a room to another local prostitute named Maria Harvey. It's been speculated that Mary and Maria were in a romantic relationship by some, but others seem to believe that they simply worked together. Regardless, John was furious. Maria moving into their apartment meant that Kelly was going to continue doing sex work, and that she wasn't taking his pleas seriously. They allegedly got into a huge altercation, which resulted in him moving out of the apartment a week prior to her murder. John would state that the two had remained somewhat cordial, and that they continued to see each other as friends after. However, those closest to them would state that for the next week or so, he continued to show up at her home to try and win her back. He wanted her to swear off prostitution, to say that he was right, and to kick Maria out. But when she failed to buckle to his wants, some theorized that he snapped. In the hours before her death, John was seen outside of the apartment, and would later admit to visiting her. He would claim that they spoke for about an hour or so, and he informed her that he had gotten a new job and would be able to financially assist her, should she need it. Other witnesses would come forward, stating that they saw the two together earlier in the day, having drinks at a local pub. However, mere hours after he would leave the home, she'd be brutalized far beyond any of the other Ripper's victims. How Mary was killed was fundamentally different than every other victim, and the fact that hers was the last canonical death feels important. For the Ripper to stop killing after he got to Mary leads many to believe that she was the intended target the entire time, and that the Ripper killed the other four because he couldn't get to her. She was the only one killed indoors, and the only one that the Ripper spent a significant amount of time with, and from the way she was torn apart, the murder felt truly personal. He didn't want her to exist anymore, so he destroyed her, and the only person who held that kind of malice towards Mary Jean would be Barnett. The vague physical description of the Ripper that had been given throughout the investigation matched Barnett, although it matched most other men who were alive during the 1800s. He had means, motive, and opportunity to attack each of the women, as he lived directly in the comfort zone of the killer. The escape route believed to be used by the Ripper the night of the double event would go directly by Barnett's home, meaning that had he been responsible, he could have easily made his getaway, and it would make the most sense for him to contact the police, as all the evidence from the letters that were published steer the investigation away from himself. But, like every other theory, there are reasons to doubt that John had any part in the murders. Firstly, it would be a massive leap in logic for a person to begin killing prostitutes in the area in order to dissuade their partner from being a prostitute. Mary supposedly only began working as an unfortunate because John lost his job, meaning that all he would need to do to get her to stop was to find more work, which he had. To immediately jump to murder would be an incredible overreaction. There's also no direct evidence that puts him at the scene of the crime. Some reports state that envelopes addressed to him were found on the streets near the crime scenes, and that Catherine Eddowes had publicly suspected him of being behind the murders. But with no direct evidence, those claims hold no real weight. John similarly didn't have a history of violent behavior, and went on to lead a completely unremarkable life after Mary's death. In our video on H. Holmes, we ended it by discussing how he was also believed to have been Jack the Ripper, so let's expand on that. Jeff Mudgett, Holmes' great-great-grandson, would publicize this theory in 2017 after finding diaries that he claimed placed Holmes in the Whitechapel area during the time of the murder spree. He'd only learned of his familial connection to the murder in his 40s, and quickly dived down the rabbit hole of his great-great-grandfather's crimes. After discovering the diary entries, he went through the initial reports around the case. As you likely recall from yesterday's video, after the coroner discovered that Annie Chapman's womb had been removed, he told the police constables that he had heard a rumor of a shady American doctor who had approached medical schools with a, quote, deal on wombs, unquote. This person allegedly stated that they would be able to procure uteruses for the schools without issue, and the coroner stated that the doctor was around 5'7", 150 pounds, between the ages of 25 and 35, and American, which Holmes matched to a T. As we covered in that video, this statement has fallen under a significant amount of scrutiny, as many experts believe that Annie Chapman's womb was taken by a mortuary attendant looking to pad their own pockets. So whether or not you believe this description is for Holmes remains entirely up to you. However, the most compelling form of evidence comes from the handwriting analysis that was done on the Jack the Ripper letters. The letters were compared to those of Holmes, and it was found that they are similar enough to have been written by the same person. The phrasing of that statement is important, because it's neither a confirmation or denial, but depending upon where you fall in believing this theory, you could take it as either. In our research, we've come across intense debates online about this subject, with some proponents of this theory saying that they were 100% confirmed, when that is not the case. Frankly, in our opinion, Holmes was not the Ripper, simply because he had nothing to gain by the evisceration of these women. He was exceptionally lazy, dedicating an entire floor of a castle to killing people because he was too lazy to do it himself. And unless he could financially gain from someone or they were physically in his way, he wasn't necessarily motivated to kill. Though the theory is interesting, everything we have learned about Holmes makes us believe that he is not the Ripper. Another person who has recently fallen under suspicion as being Jack the Ripper is renowned Impressionist painter Walter Sickert. One of the main reasons that people link Walter to the Ripper murders is his proximity to the events and his interest in the gruesome details of the case. Walter lived in London during the late 19th century, often frequenting areas like Whitechapel, where the Ripper murders occurred. He was known to have a fascination with crime and death, and some accounts suggest that he was morbidly interested in the Ripper case. This connection to the time and place of the murders makes him an intriguing suspect, though it is not in itself incriminating. A significant piece of evidence cited by proponents of the Sickert theory is his artwork, which some interpret as having connections to the Ripper crimes. Critics point to paintings like The Camden Town Murder, which depict violent or unsettling scenes of women in vulnerable positions. These works, created years after the Ripper murders, have been seen by some as a reflection of guilt or a subconscious confession. However, others argue that Sickert's art was simply inspired by the sensationalism and social issues of his time, rather than personal involvement in the killings. Another factor fueling suspicions is Walter's alleged use of a lodging house where Jack the Ripper might have stayed. Some sources claim that Walter lived in a room that was supposedly used by the Ripper during the murders. Although there is no definitive evidence or proof of this, it has contributed to the narrative that Walter had a close connection to the case, more so than initially believed. The theory gained widespread attention through Patricia Cornwell's 2002 book, Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed. Cornwell argued that Sickert was the Ripper, based on a combination of circumstantial evidence and DNA analysis of letters supposedly written by the killer. She claimed that mitochondrial DNA found on these letters matched samples of Sickert's correspondence. However, this type of DNA is not unique and can be shared by thousands of people, making the results inconclusive. Critics also point out that many of the Ripper letters are considered hoaxes, further weakening Cornwell's claims. Despite the intrigue surrounding Walter, there are significant reasons to doubt his involvement. For one, there is no direct evidence tying him to any of the murders. Furthermore, Sickert was in France during some of the Ripper killings, making it highly unlikely that he could have been the perpetrator. The final theory that we'll be reviewing is the theory that Charles Allen Lechmere, also known as Charles Cross, is the Ripper. First identified as a suspect in 2014 by researcher Christopher Holmgren, Charles had long been a peripheral figure in the Ripper case. He was a meat cart driver who lived and worked in Whitechapel during the time of the Ripper murders. His connection to the case arises from the discovery of the body of Mary Ann Nichols, the Ripper's first canonical victim. Though initially regarded as a concerned citizen who stumbled upon the crime scene, modern theorists suggest he may have been the killer himself. On August 31st, 1888, Charles was on his way to work in the early hours of the morning when he came across the body of Polly Nichols on Buck's Row. Another man, Robert Paul, arrived shortly after, and together they alerted the police. At first glance, Charles appeared to be a witness who happened upon the scene. However, proponents of the theory that Charles was the Ripper argue that his behavior that night was suspicious. Charles claimed to have found the body of Nichols, but when Paul arrived, he appeared calm and suggested that Nichols was likely drunk or unconscious, despite the extensive wounds that would have been visible on her neck. Critics argued that this reaction indicates that he was attempting to downplay the situation to avoid suspicion. Furthermore, Charles gave his name to the police as Charles Cross, his stepfather's surname, a detail some theorists view as an attempt to obscure his identity. It should be noted that this practice of switching your surname with your birth name was commonplace at the time, while if a person was to do the same in a more recent case, it would be easily seen as a sign of guilt, so there's a reason it didn't draw suspicion during the initial investigation. This would also explain the inconsistency with how Polly had been found. Because of Charles and Robert's statements, it was believed that the killer left the scene when he saw them approach, then he returned to finish the job. Though Charles and Paul were adamant that Polly wasn't bleeding when they found her, it's just as likely that she was, and Charles merely gaslit Paul about the extent of her wounds. Had Paul been drinking that night or hung over from the night before, he could have been led to believe that Polly was fine and had simply passed out. Mapping Charles' known movements and his work schedule reveals that he had ample opportunity to commit the murders. The timing of the Ripper attacks aligns with the times that Charles would have been traveling to his job as a meat cart driver. His familiarity with the streets and alleys of Whitechapel would have allowed him to navigate quickly and evade detection, even in the chaotic aftermath of the killings. Proponents of the Lechmere theory argue that this behavior fits the profile of a serial killer. His apparent composure when, quote, discovering, unquote, Polly Nichols, and his insistence on reporting this to the police could be interpreted as an attempt to control the narrative and insert himself into the investigation, a behavior sometimes observed in serial killers. Additionally, his profession as a meat cart driver may have given him skills with knives, which could explain the precision of the Ripper's mutilations. While there is no evidence that Charles exhibited violent tendencies outside of the Ripper murders, theorists suggest that his job provided him with a plausible cover. Working in the meat industry would have made it easier for him to carry and clean knives without raising suspicion. It also provided him with access to locations where blood and gore were part of everyday life, potentially desensitizing him to violence. Like most of the other theories, this one revolves around blind speculation. The very idea that he could be the Ripper stems largely from the fact that he was the first one to find a body, and that he gave a false name to the police. It truly depends on which theory you find more compelling. However, there is one breakthrough in the case that we should discuss. In 2014, new claims emerged suggesting that DNA evidence might finally have solved the mystery of Jack the Ripper. Dr. Jari Luhalainen, a molecular biologist, analyzed a shawl reportedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper's fourth canonical victim at the behest of British author Russell Edwards. Edwards became fascinated with the case after watching the movie From Hell in 2001 and felt inspired to try and solve the mystery himself. After researching for some time, Edwards came upon the shawl that Eddowes had been wearing at the time of the murder at an auction, and quickly scooped it up with the hopes that he would be able to find the final piece of evidence to put the case to bed. And surprisingly, he did, or at the very least, he claimed he did. Jari's analysis identified mitochondrial DNA on the shawl, which he matched to a living descendant of Eddowes. Additionally, semen stains on the shawl were analyzed and reportedly linked to a descendant of Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber and one of the long-standing Ripper suspects. Jari's DNA analysis seemed to provide the missing link, a genetic connection between Kosminski and one of the crime scenes. However, this conclusion was met with skepticism and criticism from experts in various fields, and the theory has not been universally accepted. One significant issue lies in the provenance of the shawl. The object's chain of custody over more than 130 years since the murder is highly questionable. There is no definitive evidence that the shawl was present at the crime scene or belonged to Eddowes. It was reportedly taken by Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, who allegedly kept it as a souvenir. This lack of documentation or verification undermines the reliability of the shawl as evidence. Skeptics argue that without an unbroken chain of custody, any DNA found on the shawl could have been introduced at any point over the years. Many experts also take issue with the fact that the findings were first published in the Daily Mail, and nothing had been done to confirm them. When the test was looked into by experts, it was found that Jari had made a fundamental error that, quote, fatally undermined his case, unquote. The following is a quote from The Independent. The scientist, Jari Luhalainen, is said to have made an error of nomenclature when using a DNA database to circulate the chances of a genetic match. If true, it would mean his calculations were wrong and that virtually anyone could have left the DNA that he insisted came from the Ripper's victim. They say the error means no DNA connection can be made between Kosminski and Eddowes. Any suggestion, therefore, that the Ripper and Kosminski are the same person appears to be based on conjecture and suspicion, as it has been ever since the police first identified Kosminski as a possible suspect more than a century ago. But experts with detailed knowledge of the GMI's mtDNA database claimed that Dr. Luhalainen made an error of nomenclature because the mutation in question should be written as 315.1c and not 314.1c. Had Dr. Luhalainen done this and followed standard forensic practice, he would have discovered the mutation was not rare at all, but shared by more than 99% of people of European descent, meaning that despite Russell's claims, the DNA found on the shawl proved nothing. It's unlikely that we will ever know definitively who Jack the Ripper is, largely stemming from the lack of physical evidence left at the scenes, which is likely why the case is so well known. If we had an easy answer, it would be unlikely that we would still be talking about Jack today. There are truly hundreds of potential suspects in this case, and we could make 10 more videos going over all of them. But we will leave this here. If there is a theory we didn't cover, one that you feel is stronger than the ones presented, let me know by leaving them in the comments down below. I highly encourage you to engage with others in the comments section, as there is so much more to learn, so I'll be reading alongside you. With all of that said, if there's a video you would like to see made, or a case you want to bring more attention to, email us at dreading.official@gmail.com. Have a great day, and remember, stay safe.